So we're supposed to have a test starting today. Obviously, we're not having a test today. Maybe I should have just printed one and showed up with it and been like, "Are y'all ready? Here we go." You know, that might have been a fun sort of trick for me to play with you guys. My guess is what will happen is we will probably try to finish Metabolism 1 today and on Thursday. We'll probably just have the test in the class portion of the test next Tuesday. Okay. Is that okay? Anybody having problems with that? Do we have a test in any other classes? We're not like backed up right on top of a stack or anything. It's gonna be kind of a big issue.
The stats test is the 26th.
Okay. Seeing and hearing no objections to those things. Then that's going to be our current plan until I decide to alter it. Or, okay. Anybody Star Wars fans at all? Nobody? Okay, no Star Wars fans. Never mind. And when I quote Darth Vader from Empire, you guys, it won't matter. Nobody will care. It's fine. You like defining things with my youth here. Y'all scoff at them. It's okay. All right. Let's review for just a minute, okay? When we talk about aerobic metabolism, what are we talking about? Somebody tell me. Oxygen being used, good, Ryan, that's right. We're using oxygen. What are we making? Energy, good. Where is this energy made? Where is this oxygen being used, Jacob? In the mitochondria, okay. So in order to start using aerobic metabolism, assuming that I'm going to use a molecule of glucose. Where is that glucose initially? Where is it going to be located?
Well, it's coming from either the muscle or the blood, but it's going to be in the cytoplasm through glycolysis.
Very good, Kelly. Very good. Okay. Our carbohydrate substrates are going to start this process of being broken down aerobically through glycolysis. And that's going to take place in the cytoplasm. The glucose will either come from muscle glycogen or it will come from blood glucose that's been brought in. Okay? So we've done all of that. Remember, we talked about glycolysis. Glycolysis is exclusively anaerobic, even though I have it written in not that way in the slides, and it is sometimes referred to as aerobic and anaerobic glycolysis. But basically, we're going to take glucose and we're going to metabolize it down to what particular molecule before we go into the Krebs cycle?
Well, pyruvate.
Pyruvate, okay? Very good. We're going to metabolize it to pyruvate. Glucose has 6 carbons. Pyruvate has how many carbons? 3, okay? So 1 glucose molecule broken down to 2 3-carbon pyruvate molecules, right? And it's that pyruvate that is that's our break point, basically. The pyruvate can go to lactic acid, and we can recycle, give some electrons back and make lactic acid, or it can go over, it can get bound up with coenzyme A, we make a little bit of carbon dioxide, we lose a carbon, we now have acetyl coenzyme A, and then that acetyl group gets stuck into the Krebs cycle, right? And it's going to be bound onto oxaloacetate, which is a 4-carbon molecule, and we make citrate, which is a 6-carbon molecule, and we spin around and around, right? Like my daughter, she likes to twirl. She just twirls like this. She twirls and she twirls until she gets dizzy, and then she falls down, and then she cackles. It's very funny. That's the Krebs cycle, okay? So we're not done yet. We make a little bit of ATP, right, directly during glycolysis. We make a little bit of GTP, which then gets converted to ATP directly in the Krebs cycle every time we go around. So remember, we've got 2 pyruvate molecules, so we're going to have to send each one of them through the Krebs cycle, so we're technically going to go through twice. The other thing that happens at the Krebs cycle, and that happens to some extent, okay, with in our glycolytic pathway, is that we're going to capture electrons. As we pull off the carbons, as we change our biochemical structure, we're going to oxidize and we're going to grab electrons off of those molecules, and we're going to bind them onto these electron carriers, onto NAD and FAD. Okay? They're going to then pull some hydrogen along with them, because hydrogens exist basically as a proton rather than anything with an electron, because they're such a weak electrical field, or their nucleus is so small it has a, we're not going to get into chemistry of all of that. Okay? The end point of all of this, though, the reason that we can make so much more energy in the aerobic pathways is because of all of these electrons that we've been building up and we've been capturing so far through the Krebs cycle and a little bit in glycolysis. Okay? So at the end of all of this, once we have completed and things have gone through the Krebs cycle, we're going to take the electrons on those electron carriers, and they are going to then donate them or give them up onto these things called cytochromes, which are going to make up the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain is located on the inner membrane of the mitochondria, okay, on the inner membrane. The Krebs cycle has been happening in that space on the inside, in there, okay, and then this is in the inner membrane, so it's very close in its locations, which is important, okay. So cytochromes want to bind the electrons because, much like hemoglobin, cytochromes contain iron, okay. Does anybody know the molecular charge on iron? Anybody remember your chemistry? That's correct. It's 2+, okay? So it is quite positively charged. It is very greedy. It wants those electrons. And so because there's iron there, the pull onto the cytochrome is going to be greater than the kind of weak forces holding it on NAD and FAD. And so we're going to donate them on the cytochromes. NADH and FADH will donate their electrons at different cytochromes, at different points in the electron transport chain. And then once it starts in the transport chain, then it gets passed from one to the next. So like I would give something to Callie, and then Callie gives those electrons to Kelvin, Kelvin gives them to Jacob, Jacob gives them to Ryan, and then Ryan turns them into energy, okay? You get the good spot down there, Ryan, all right? Whereas like an NAD would give it to Callie, and an FAD might give it to Jacob, okay? And so the farther that it moves, the more cytochromes it comes into contact with, the farther it moves on the chain, then the more we're able to create this gradient with hydrogen. It's going to allow us to make more ATP at the end, okay? So when we kind of add up our energy yield, we get, for the same electrons that are on NADH, we're going to get more ATP than we're going to get for electrons that are on FADH, okay? So as these things move, as we ping from one cytochrome to the next, we are going to, they give up their electrons, those hydrogens that have trailed with them are going to get pumped out, okay? Pumped out of the inside into that kind of outer membrane space on the mitochondria. It creates this big concentration gradient for hydrogen, and at the very, very end, then we open up and we bring those hydrogen back in along their gradient that runs this AT or powers this ATP synthase enzyme. We're going to make ATP. At the end of all of this, okay, we need oxygen. So we've passed everything down. Ryan has the electrons, okay? Hydrogen comes rushing back in. She makes ATP, but she's got to give away her electrons to something, okay? And so she would give them to oxygen. The oxygen wants the electrons. It then takes those hydrogens that have been flowing by it, binds them onto that oxygen, and it makes water. Okay? So oxygen is the final electron acceptor. Without oxygen, the whole system gets backed up because we can't continue to pass things if Ryan can only hold so many electrons and she gets stuck with them. She's got to give them to something else to clear it back up so they can keep coming. Okay? That's why oxygen is an absolute necessity for aerobic metabolism. Okay? It's an absolute necessity. If you don't have oxygen, then the electron transport chain gets backed up. If the electron transport chain gets backed up, then you can't clear the electrons off of NADH and FADH, so they can't go back to the Krebs cycle and continue to grab electrons, so then the Krebs cycle shuts down, and if the Krebs cycle shuts down, then it can't accept pyruvate, and if it can't accept pyruvate, then all the pyruvate is going to get converted then into lactic acid, and that's going to make hydrogen ions, and eventually that's going to cause you to fatigue. That's a mouthful. Okay? There's all of metabolism right there. Okay? That's the whole thing. No need to take Dr. Deb's doctoral class on it. That's it right there. 30-second explanation. Okay? So in the most kind of particular of senses we make about 2.5 ATP per NADH and about 1.5 ATP per FADH. Obviously, we don't make half an ATP. We talked about that last time. Accounting wise, that's what it works out to. That means that, like, for one pyruvate, sorry, my throat is kind of scratchy. For one pyruvate, you're going to make 3. For one, you're going to make 2. It averages out to 2.5. Okay. So here's what all of this looks like. Okay. This is the inner kind of matrix of a mitochondria. There's actually going to be 2 membranes. There's a membrane around this, and there's a little bit of space out here. Okay. Then there's going to be the cytosol. What you can see is here's glucose and pyruvate. We jam that in here. We run the Krebs cycle. We're reducing all of our different things. Here's the electron transport chain. Boom, 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 boom. We're passing things down. We're pumping the hydrogen out into here. We let it back in. Here's my oxygen. I'm making water. I'm making ATP. Then that ATP gets translocated out of the mitochondria into the cytosol. And ADP gets translocated back into the mitochondria so that it can basically take the phosphate that's coming back from there. Okay, so we're just shuttling all of these things around. And when it doesn't work, we die. Okay? It usually works really, really well. It usually works really well. Okay, so there's another picture. I don't think I'm ever going to really ask you to do an accounting like all of this, but you can count up all of the ATP if you want to, like the ones that you're making. At various points. Okay. Okay. So the next piece of all of this, we've talked about our pathways. So we generally have some idea about where we're getting our energy. I now want to come back and talk about how we measure this and what we know about some things that are going on during exercise because of this, before we go on in the second half in Metabolism 2 to talk about how these things all fit together, how we regulate them, how do we control the speed of all of them. I think it's now important to kind of contextualize a little bit further above and beyond just the pathways. Okay? So we need to talk first about, if we're talking about metabolism, we're talking about making energy or measuring kind of energy use. So we need to understand how to do that. Okay? If I want to know, right, how much ATP Pearson needs just sitting there, well, we got to figure out, well, how in the hell do we measure that? Okay? And so then if I want to know if Pearson goes from sitting to jogging to running, how much energy does he need for each of those other things? Then we need to kind of understand how we can measure it. Okay? So if we look at a kind of simplified energy equation, okay, where we're going to take glucose and ADP and oxygen, and then we're going to, via aerobic metabolism, right, we're going to make ATP, we're going to make CO2, we make water, and we make heat. Okay? So if I want to measure how much ATP you're making, it's very hard. Remember, there's a small amount of ATP and it just fluxes all the time. It goes ATP, ADP, back to ATP, back to ADP. Okay? And so it's hard for us in real time to get a very good accurate measure there. So that leaves us then with wanting to look at one of these other two parameters, which is going to be carbon dioxide or heat. And if we assume then that this equation almost always balances, if we know how much CO2 we are producing, we can guess at then how much oxygen we've been using, and we can guess at approximately how much ATP we've been making. Additionally, if we know how much heat we've produced, then we can also kind of get at this. So weirdly enough, the single best way to measure energy expenditure in a person is to measure heat production. Okay, is we're going to take Alex, we're going to put him in a room. It's going to be a small room, Alex. Okay, and it has these coils that have water running through them in the walls, and you just sit there. And your body gives off this little bit of heat just by being alive, and that heat gets taken up into the walls and heats up the water in those coils ever so slightly, and then based upon how much of that we can guess at your heat production. This is called a direct measure, direct calorimetry, or direct measure of metabolism, is to measure heat production. One of the other ways, this way is not very feasible, okay? One, it's super duper expensive, and I got to trap you in a room, a small room, for some period of time, right? So the next best way is to measure what we would call indirectly, and that means that we're going to measure basically carbon dioxide production, okay? We can measure our byproducts, we can look at CO2, and then if we know normal O2 concentrations in the air, normal CO2 concentrations in the air, we can look at O2 and CO2 in expired air and kind of guess at and back calculate this equation. This is called an indirect calorimetry. Okay? This is the way that almost every study that we're going to encounter in this class, or that you guys have probably seen to date in your lives, does things. Okay? When we measure oxygen consumption, we measure maximal oxygen consumption or resting oxygen consumption, we are generally doing it via indirect calorimetry. Okay? What I also want to point out, okay, these are measures that estimate aerobic metabolism. I think I mentioned this last week or the week before. We cannot, in any kind of easy, feasible, cost-effective manner, measure anaerobic energy production. Okay? We can't do it. We can get at, to some extent, creatine phosphate breakdown. Okay? We can sort of guess at some things by measuring lactate production, but we're stuck with measuring blood lactate, which is kind of a balance of production and clearance and things. It's hard for us to get at real numbers. Okay? So really, anaerobic metabolism is a black box. It's hard for us to know very much about all of that. Okay? So these are going to be aerobic things. So we know a lot about measuring aerobic metabolism, but not very much about anaerobic. Why is that? Oh! Oh, let's sit over there. We're missing the little plug-in thing. Now, who takes the plug-in for the remote? You want to see it laying around anywhere? It looks like a flash drive. Let me blame Dr. Chambers.
He didn't have it during his class either.
Okay. So we talked about this, right? We talked a little bit about direct calorimetry is really, really accurate and it's super expensive. You can put yourself in a room that looks like this. I don't think we have one of these in the state of Oklahoma anywhere. I know there's one in Arkansas at the Med Center in Little Rock. And when I say it's a small room, like, I don't know, like it's like the size of maybe like your bedroom or something. It's small. And they have like a bed and a couch and a TV, and like, people will just like stay in there for several days. Or you can throw a treadmill in there and have them exercise on the treadmill. I think somewhere in Germany they have a mock-up of the International Space Station, that the whole thing is a direct calorimeter like this. And they do this if you're going to get sent to the International Space Station, like they will take people and send them there for like 90 days at a time. You you can't leave, you don't see the sun, it's not weightless, but they're really trying to figure out, like, if you're isolated like this, are you going to freak the hell out? Because we send you to space, like, you're kind of stuck for a while. We can't just send a rescue mission up there to get you. I think they have one. I'm pretty sure that I saw some data at one of our conferences one year about all of that. I mean, right? So a couple of things to appreciate when we do indirect calorimetry, okay? In a normal year, I would have gone downstairs and we would have wheeled one of the metabolic carts over into the hub, put it on the elevator, brought it up, and then wheeled it over here. We just would have made Keldon pick it up and put it up here, walk it up the stairs so that you guys can see. But we do indirect calorimetry with a piece of equipment called a metabolic cart. How many of you guys have seen a metabolic cart or used a metabolic cart at some point, like in one of your undergraduate classes or something? Kelly, you didn't? Did you take exercise phys lab or anything as an undergrad? Okay. So for Callie and Pearson, who haven't seen these, a metabolic cart is basically a little box, okay? And you run a hose into this box, and it has oxygen and CO2 sensors in it. And we put some sort of facial apparatus on you. It could be a mask. It could be this kind of giant mouthpiecey thing that you put in, and it clamps down on your head. Most people don't like that when they prefer that you just put a mask on. And then it has one side that lets you breathe air in from out here in the room, and then there's a tube that collects all of the air that you breathe out. You pinch off your nose, right? It's super awkward. You can't breathe through your nose. You've never had a bad time till you're doing a VO2 max test on a treadmill and you're getting really close to max, and your nose is pinched off, and you try to take a big deep breath, and you also sort of accidentally, like, you're trying to suck air through your nose, and you almost practically choke yourself because you're closing off. I have bad memories of this, as you guys can tell from when I was a grad student doing these things. But so you blow off, we get all the air that you blow out, we run that past our VO2 and our CO2 sensors in this thing, and it measures both the amount of air that you're breathing out and the content of oxygen and CO2 in that air. If we know what the CO2 and O2 content in normal room air is, we have to calibrate that. Normal room air is one thing, air coming out is going to be different, and so you can use the differences in those two things, and you can use the amount of air that's getting blown by to kind of calculate in a rather sophisticated manner if the amount that oxygen dips and CO2 goes up in the expired air is going to be highly related to how much oxygen is being used in your muscles and how much CO2 is being released there. There's a couple of assumptions that we have to make on all of that we're not really going to get into, but we're going to assume that it's working. So we end up with some terminology that looks like this, okay? And so there's a term called VO2. The V stands for volume, okay? And it's the volume of oxygen. So we call VO2 oxygen uptake. It is the volume of oxygen consumed or used by muscles or other tissues, okay? And the other side of this is going to be the volume of CO2 that you are expiring. There should be, okay, an approximate inverse relationship between these two things. No, I'm sorry, not inverse. Okay. Oh God, what's the inverse of inverse? Yeah, there's a reasonably proportional. So as O2 use goes up, CO2 production is going to increase. My brain is not going to work right today. I apologize. Okay. But the volume means the volume is an amount. It's usually like measured in liters, okay, at least initially. We're going to convert it to something That's what's meant by our terminology there, okay? Both of these parameters are going to be really, really important for us. So when we look at energy expenditure specifically during exercise, we will note that energy use is directly proportional to work rate during exercise, or the exercise intensity. Work rate is related to force production, okay? So the more force that you produce, the more ATP you need at your cross bridges, then the greater your energy expenditures will be. So as exercise intensity increases, oxygen uptake goes up, okay? CO2 production, or PCO2, goes up, okay? So we see a relatively linear increase. As work rate goes up, VO2 goes up in kind of direct proportion to all of that. If work rate is constant, okay, I go standing, then I start marching. I was doing this in my undergrad class yesterday. They did not appreciate it. And I start marching at some rate, okay? Once I've done this for a minute or two, as long as the rate is exactly the same, I'm going at the same speed, I weigh the same, gravity is the same, okay? Then my energy use is going to climb, and then it's going to plateau off, and it's going to stay exactly the same as long as the work I'm doing stays the same, okay? That work goes up and plateaus off is called a steady state, okay? It's called a steady state. This is really, really important, okay? Because when we talk about the responses to exercise, then only exercises of certain intensities will allow us to reach a steady state, okay? Typically stuff that is under to maybe just slightly-ish over lactate threshold will let us reach a steady state. High intensity exercise, you're never going to reach this VO2 steady state, okay? So this is really, really important. At higher work rates, it doesn't want to level off. This is called a slow component rise. And this slow component rise, when we fail to get to steady state, that can be indicative that anaerobic metabolism is playing a larger and larger kind of role in providing us energy. Okay? It also likely indicates that your movement economy is getting worse. Okay? You're running and you're kind of flailing about. Okay? You feel very uncoordinated. I ran this morning here on campus. It was nice and cool this morning. I didn't feel completely shitty, but I finally pushed my pace under a 9-minute mile for the first time in 6 months, and I felt wildly uncoordinated. I was just kind of flailing. I was like, oh God, I look like an idiot. But I was out there and I saw some dogs. It was great. So that's a slow component rise. Okay. So if we look at things, okay, here on the x-axis, this would be cycling exercise. So we measure watts is work rate, okay, for cycling. So think of this as the resistance on the pedals, basically, as you're going, right? As the resistance gets higher and higher on the pedals, the work rate goes up. Here's oxygen uptake, or VO2. That's this line here, okay? So as this goes up, there's going to be this nice linear increase in oxygen consumption. Also graphed on here, okay, is what might happen to lactic acid or blood lactate levels. So you can see somewhere right about here is our lactate threshold. And what we also tend to see in some people is right at about lactate threshold, there may be this tiny little blip of an sort of uptick in VO2, where the slope of that line shifts ever so subtly, okay? And so up to here, if you put yourself at 50 and you held 50 constant, it would be flat. At about 100, it's probably going to be flat. At 200 out here, it's going to come up and it's just going to drift on us. It's not going to want to level off, even though your work rate is the same. Okay? If you've ever had that experience of I'm running, I'm biking, I don't know, I'm walking backwards up the Stairmaster, I see all kinds of crazy shit over in the hub, right? It's mostly women on the Stairmaster doing weird things, right? Like crossover on the Stairmaster like this, or it's up and then like kickbacks and things, or sideways. I'm like, I don't really know I don't think that's the point. Like those are all potentially reasonable exercises to do. I'm just not sure why we're doing them on the Stairmaster. It sucks enough as it is. So that's kind of what's happening. Okay? All right. So another thing that we can do that's very important from a metabolic standpoint is we can use our values, our measured values from indirect calorimetry of oxygen consumption and CO2 production to get at something called the respiratory quotient, okay? Which actually in humans measured via indirect calorimetry becomes the respiratory exchange ratio. So the importance of RER, or the respiratory quotient, which is called RQ, the importance of these two things is it gives us information about the proportion of aerobic energy that is being derived from carbohydrate and the proportion that is being derived from fat, okay? And this is because, as you guys will see a little bit later on, based upon where carbohydrates and where fat enter into aerobic metabolism, the amount of carbon dioxide that we produce for every 2 carbons of each that goes through is going to differ. And if that amount of carbon dioxide is a little bit different, then our VCO2 is going to be a little bit different. So respiratory quotient is going to talk about direct CO2 production and O2 use in the cell, okay? We can measure RQ, but it's usually in isolated cells or in like an anesthetized animal, okay? Jacob's probably seen this done with poor little rats and things in Poole's lab and those kinds of things. So what we measure in people is not RQ. It is not the respiratory quotient, okay? It is something called RER, and that is the volume of CO2 produced divided by the volume of oxygen that is consumed, okay? If we are during steady state exercise, RER gives us this estimate of kind of non-protein substrate contributions to aerobic metabolism, okay? So, an RER of 1.0, where VCO2 and VO2 are exactly equal, okay, is going to denote that we are solely using carbohydrate as our energy substrate, okay? It's directly equal. The amount of O2 used is directly equal to CO2 produced. If you were metabolizing only fat, okay, only fat, then your RER would be about 0.7. And that's because you're going to make less carbon dioxide for every oxygen that you're using because of where fat enters into all of this. It just makes less CO2, okay? So 0.7 would be all fat. Personally, I've never seen someone with an RER of 0.7, but it is within the realm of possibility, I guess, right? You're a keto person, I don't know, you just want to eat some Crisco for a while. Why don't you just get you one of those sticks of Crisco and you just melt it down and you drink it? I don't know. Look, people do weird things. You pour your coconut oil into your coffee or whatever so that, you know, you're on your keto thing and you're going to feel full for days on end or whatever. That's probably going to lower your RER, okay? At rest, okay? If you eat a normal mixed diet, okay, where you're having some fat and some protein and some carbohydrate, okay, which we can argue about what it ought to be at some other day, your RER is going to be probably between, you know, around like 0.82, 0.83. At rest, okay, we tend to derive slightly more of our energy from fat than from carbohydrate. As exercise intensity increases, we tend to derive larger and larger proportion of our aerobic energy from carbohydrate. Okay? We'll talk about VO2 max and measuring VO2 max in a few minutes. One of the ways that we know you have reached your VO2 max is that your RER is actually going to go over 1. Okay? For some separate reasons, but you're basically using exclusively carbohydrate. Okay? We're not going to get too far into kind of the hows and the whys, like why won't you use fat at very high intensities and those things. That's what RER is going to tell us. Okay? Okay. So here is, and I freaking saved this. Oh, I know why it's different. Okay. So let's talk about maximal oxygen uptake. And I asked you this question on the quiz. Okay. VO2 max is going to indicate the highest rate, the largest amount of oxygen that you can take into your body at the lungs, bind onto hemoglobin in your blood, circulate via cardiac output, okay? Provide to your muscles through the capillaries and diffusion, get the oxygen in, and then use in your mitochondria, okay? As you will note, I wrote that it is the highest rate oxygen can be taken up into the blood at the lungs during dynamic physical work involving large muscle groups, which is what many of you put on your quiz, and I took off a half a point because I said you didn't really talk about getting it to the muscles and utilizing it in the muscles whatsoever. That's only because I'm a dumbass and I didn't write it on. So that's on me, okay? That's on me. And I wrote a new definition of this and I saved it, but it's in my Dropbox, and I did not replace the version of the PowerPoints that are on Canvas, and I downloaded this one from Canvas, which is why it's not there. VO2 max is an integrative measurement, okay? It involves proper function or necessitates proper function of the pulmonary system, of your lungs, okay? Proper function of the cardiovascular system, and proper function of mitochondria in the muscles and the interactions that go on between all three of those systems, okay? So it's integrative. In most people, the lungs are never a problem, unless they are a problem, unless maybe you have COVID, or you have emphysema, or asthma, or COPD. If the lungs are a problem, I'm sorry, you're fucked, right? I mean, there's no way around it. Like the rest of your system can be fine, but if you can't get the air in, or you can't diffuse the oxygen at the lungs, then there's nothing else that we can do about things, right? It's one of the worst possible things, okay? Cardiovascular system-wise, we will talk a lot about stroke volume and cardiac output and how we direct blood to certain areas, but we need that to function properly. Then we need to be able to diffuse it from our capillaries into the muscle. And then once we get the oxygen in the muscle, we need to have mitochondria to be able to put it into to help us make energy aerobically. Okay? So it is all of this stuff integrated together. Any one of these little steps breaks down. There's lots of arguments about, is it actually limited by central circulatory capacity? Is it limited by the capacity of the mitochondria to do different things? We can alter the experimental conditions and essentially prove both in a lot of those things. But what this is, what this represents in most people is your maximal ability to make ATP in your mitochondria. Okay? This is the highest volume and the highest rate at which oxygen can be used. Okay? The way we assess this in most people sucks. Okay? It sucks. Who's had a VO2 max test done? Ooh, okay. Good. Would you all like to explain to Callie and Pearson what it feels like, Megan?
Terrible.
Okay. Tell us what you did. Walk us through what you did.
So we did some Dr. Pepper stuff.
Oh, y'all do the worst protocol in the world in there. That's okay. Keep going. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and we also had the stupid mouthpiece with like the mask, and I wanted to like literally gag me for time. But what we did was a little warm up and like resistance on the sphygmomanometer. And then I don't remember the exact protocol off the top of my head, but every, I think it was like 2 or 3 minutes, the pump up their resistance. And basically, it just sucks really bad about 5, 8 minutes in, and you just gotta keep going, keep going, and then you got.
So you rode the bike, right, at increasing intensities until you could no longer turn the pedals, basically, is the way to describe
At
it.
the certain RPM.
Yeah. So the protocol that Dr. Deb uses in there is terrible. It's especially terrible for women. They do 3-minute stages, and they do like these 50-watt jumps on the bike, which is a huge amount, especially as you get higher and higher, because women tend to be smaller than men. And when you're on the bike and it's weight supported, just having a lot of strength and muscle mass is actually helpful in some ways, unlike when you run. And so that protocol is really aggressive, and sometimes for women. Dr. Larson has some twists that she has kind of personalized onto things. But the essence when you do this, we test VO2 max by, we're going to put you on an exercise apparatus, and we're going to have you go for like a minute or 2 minutes, and then we're going to make it harder. And you're going to go for 2 more minutes, and we're going to make it harder. We're going to keep doing that until you die, basically. Until you cannot go anymore, right? You can't run any farther or any faster. You cannot turn the pedals on the bike. You can't do one more step on the Stairmaster. So in theory, we can do a VO2 max test on any exercise kind of piece of equipment possible if we really wanted to, okay? There's some estimation protocols where you can, like in my undergraduate lab, since we can't be near each other, they're gonna walk. They're gonna do what's called a 6-minute walk test. You measure the distance that you can walk in 6 minutes, and it is surprisingly accurate. As long as you try when you're walking at estimating what your VO2 max is. So the best way that we know that we've gotten you to VO2 max, and this is why some of the protocols really, really suck, okay, is the most ideal way is we're going to do this kind of stepping up of work rate. So you're on the bike, and you're going at something, and it steps up, you go, and it steps, and it does things like this. Like this would be like 50 watts, and we'll say 75 watts, and 100 watts, and 125 watts or something, okay? And so what should happen if I graph your VO2 on all of this is VO2 is going to go up, and then it's going to level off. It's going to go up, and it's going to level off. And it's going to go up, and it's going to kind of drift, and it's going to keep drifting, and then at some point, you're going to stop, okay? You can't finish. The best way that we know you've actually reached your max is you got to here, okay? And then we bumped it to 150, and your VO2 did not go up anymore, okay? Let me tell you, this is one of the best criteria. This is called a plateau in oxygen consumption. So work rate increases, but there is no further increase in oxygen consumption. This is the single best criteria for attainment of VO2 max. It almost never happens, okay? It almost never happens. Because by the time you get to VO2 max and you've been going for 6 or 8 or 12, if you're going more than 12 minutes, we missed on the test, it's too long, you're spent. And you can't then go up a level and do more work, right? So imagine this. I'm going and I'm running or I'm biking, okay? I'm at VO2 max, you increase the work rate and I can keep going. How? How am I able to keep going? How am I able to get more energy? Anaerobic metabolism. It has to come from anaerobic metabolism. The problem is that as I'm nearing my max, I'm also using a lot of anaerobic metabolism because the work rate is so high. And oftentimes, I just don't have much left to be able to further increase. So there's a fix for all of this. Does anybody know what the fix is?
Well, you have them like rest and then put them back at that same level for work rate to see if it's the same or do it the same. So it will get higher again.
You're close. You have them rest, you have them go again. But what do we need to make sure that we do?
Go up, increasing the intensity a little bit more.
Increase the intensity a little bit more. Okay? So you can do what's called a validation protocol. So you've done this, and you've gone out here and you've spent, and then we let you rest for 20 minutes, and we put you back on the treadmill or back on the bike again, and we start you off where you finished, and then we hope that you can basically then go at a higher work rate. We're going to force the work rate higher to see if we can then, while you're not quite as fatigued, to see if we can force your VO2 to go up. We're going to try to cheat the protocol. And so in doing it that way, doing the validation protocol is really the best way to know for sure what your VO2 max is. Okay? And so there's a guy at Kansas State, David Poole, their lab, they have a paper on kind of the best and most proper way to do these validation protocols and like what it needs to be, the duration and the increase and those things are. But that's the way that we know them. Okay? In the absence, yes, ma'am.
Without validating it, is it technically just VO2 week?
Oh God. Okay. Oh man.
I'm sorry.
No. This is a good question. So let me talk about what this next thing is, and then we're going to come back to that question. Okay? Because you've hit upon one of the great arguments in all of exercise physiology that we have, and it's apropos of nothing, and none of it really matters. It's all a semantical thing in a lot of ways, but it illustrates some points. Okay. So if I told you guys that under most circumstances, we're not going to get this plateau, okay? There are very few papers and very few studies, although we did one last year. Morgan Delt did on her master's thesis. We did the validation protocol. If any of you ladies, or maybe the guys might have been one of the male things. But she was looking at changes in VO2 max over the menstrual cycle. She did a validation protocol. Most people don't. Most people don't see a plateau, and they don't do a validation protocol, and yet we still think the results are pretty reasonably valid for being attainment of VO2 max. Okay, so in the absence of all of that, we're going to then look for the attainment of several indicators of what we would call a maximum effort. Okay, maximum effort. So like heart rate that is very, very near your age-predicted max heart rate. We're going to look for an RER value of over 1.1 or over 1.15. We'll talk about when we get into the ventilatory side of things that as you begin to make lactic acid, you will buffer some of that acid using bicarbonate in your blood, and that produces additional carbon dioxide that has not come directly from metabolism. So your VCO2 level is going to increase disproportionately to your oxygen consumption, and that drives RER over 1. And that tells us that you're just well over lactate threshold. We can measure blood lactate levels. In most people, we use a value of about 8 millimole in your blood, which means nothing to anybody. It's quite a bit. I've seen values into the like 17 or 18 range on some kinds of things. But you'll see some folks that will get to max and they'll be at like 6.5 or 7, and they'll meet all the other criteria. So we look for indicators of maximal effort. We also ask people to like tell us how hard was it, and let me tell you, people will lie, right? They'll be like, dude, I'm at 20 on my RP, and I'm like, no, you're not. Like your RER is 29. Like you're lying to us, okay? VO2 max is the single best indicator of cardiorespiratory endurance, or what we call aerobic fitness. Okay? Of all of the physiological measures that we can make that predict how long you're going to live or can predict your kind of overall health and well-being, VO2 max is arguably the single best one. Okay, the single best measure. If you have a high cardiorespiratory fitness, it trumps obesity. High cardiorespiratory fitness is very protective of cardiovascular disease. It's protective of type 2 diabetes. Okay. If you have high this, you're going to be a high functioning person, and you can potentially live for a very, very long time. Okay. It is not the best indicator of endurance exercise performance in groups of people who have similar VO2 maxes. We'll talk about this at the end. Okay. If some of you guys, and I'm just going to I'm going to use Callie. Callie, I don't know how much you've been running now, but there was a time when Callie was an undergrad, and I would go over to the Huff and I would try to run, and Callie would just run circles around me on the track. Okay? She may not remember this, but I remember. Because I'm like, look at Callie go, I suck. Okay? Because of all of that, I was trying hard. She appeared to be trying very hard as well, but she could clearly have beaten me in a race. Okay? She probably had a higher VO2 max than I did at that particular point. So if it's substantially higher than mine, she ought to be able to beat me in a race. If our VO2 maxes are within 5 or 10% of each other, though, then we're kind of pretty similar. And so there may be other things that will then kind of determine who's going to win the race. There's a lot of evidence on these. So if you've got a very unfit person by VO2 max and a very fit person by VO2 max, right? You've got a couch potato and a marathon runner. The marathon runner ought to win the race. But if you've got two marathon runners, okay, who are both pretty close in VO2 max and are both very, very fit, then it's probably not VO2 max that's going to be the thing that separates them. It's going to separate them from whatever. Okay? Okay. Anybody have Disney Plus? Yes. If you want to watch something cool that's related to this, get on Disney Plus and search for a thing that was on National Geographic. It's called Breaking 2. It's a documentary about Nike and the guys trying to break the 2-hour marathon. They document their first attempt where they failed. Cat's out of the bag. They did break it in their second attempt, but they talk a lot about, there's a very famous exercise physiologist, a couple of them that are on there that they're talking to, they're part of this whole thing. But they're measuring VO2 max, they're measuring movement economy. They've got these guys, and I think the guy, Kipchoge, the guy that was the best one, does not actually have the highest VO2 max out of the group. Like, he's good. He's really good, but he's not kind of where one of the other guys is. So it just kind of illustrates all of that in addition to being this kind of really cool stuff. Okay. So things that we need to be aware of when we're measuring VO2 max. So when we initially measure VO2 max, again, it's a volume of oxygen that is being consumed. Okay. This volume is pretty large, so we express it as liters of oxygen being used over some period of time. So we usually pick a minute. Okay. So it's liters per minute of oxygen being used in your body. This is referred to as the absolute expression of oxygen consumption. Okay? This is a perfectly good way to express this. It's fine. Okay? It's accurate. It tells us some things. But what it doesn't do is it does not account for the fact that oxygen consumption, or your ability to consume oxygen, is related to the amount of muscle that's in your body. Okay? And so people that are larger, they're just physically bigger, will tend to have more muscle than people that are smaller. And so therefore, their absolute need for oxygen is going to be higher, because muscles, they're metabolically active tissue. Just at rest, they're using more oxygen than a smaller person just because they have more muscle. It's always there and kind of always on. Okay? So what they found was that this absolute expression does not allow for good comparisons among people that are different sizes. Okay? It does not allow for comparison, probably because of the sizes between the different sexes. Okay? Men tend to have a lot more muscle than women under most circumstances just because they're bigger. Okay? It doesn't help us with old people versus young people. And it does not help us say anything about who is actually more fit, who has a better, per their muscle size, whose mitochondria and cardiovascular system and pulmonary system actually works better and has a larger capacity. Okay? So when you typically see VO2 max or any kind of oxygen consumption values, they are expressed relative to body weight. So you take your liters per minute value, we convert it to milliliters per minute, and then we divide that by your body weight in kilograms. So you get a value whose units are mLs per kg per minute. Okay? And that's what it is. Now, there's a school of thought that sometimes expressing it to lean body mass, so muscle mass, rather than total body weight is actually a better predictor for certain kinds of exercises, and body weight is better for like running, and lean mass is better for weight supported exercises like cycling and things, but almost everybody does it this particular way. This way allows us to compare much more accurately between people of different sizes, between the sexes, between old people and young people, and it really tells us who's technically more fit, okay? Whose integrated cardiorespiratory systems and their mitochondria functions better per their body size, okay? So that's going to be those things. So there's some other things that are in there, right? Heart size, blood volume, and things are going to also be related to body size, and so we need to account for all of that. Okay, talked about a plateau, we talked about these kinds of things. So let's talk about some values real quickly here. The average college-age male, although these numbers are probably a little on the high side now because they're from like 50 years ago when people did things, not just COVID related, but otherwise. Average college-age male is probably going to have an ml per kg per minute value somewhere in the 40s, okay? Somewhere in the 40s. The average college-age woman is probably going to be somewhere in the 30s, somewhere between 30 and 40. The men are probably between 40 and 50. Those may be a little bit on the high side. It would not surprise me that an average college-age woman is in the low 30s and the average college-age guy is in the high 30s at this point if you find people that are relatively sedentary. Not an hour major, but maybe if we went over to the engineering building with Pearson and then we might find some more sedentary folks or something. You definitely would. Okay, good. We're gonna hold you to that. Okay. So you can see when I put this together, values are likely lower in 2011. At least I've not updated these slides in a while. God, 9 years ago. If you look at values in elite distance runners or elite cyclists and things, typically elite male distance athletes are going to be in the mid to high 70s to low to mid 80s. Elite females are going to be in the high 60s to the low 70s. Okay. The highest ever recorded in men, there's this guy that's 94. I think we've had somebody that was like 96 now. Really nuts. The guy was a cyclist and he had this giant VO2 max, and like he's never won a cycling race in his life. Goes to show you about it. Those kinds of things. Women, it's about 77. Weirdly enough, the people that tend to have really high VO2 maxes are rowers and cross-country skiers, right? Anybody ever been cross-country skiing? That shit is hard. That is a workout, okay? And it's higher because you use both upper body and lower body muscles during all of this. And so your oxygen use during the exercise is actually going to be the highest because you're having to pull with your poles and stuff while also using your legs. Whereas when I run, right, I'm using my arms, but it's not quite at the same kind of engaged capacity as the other one. So the guy that taught a lot of metabolism stuff to me was our department chair at Georgia. And a lot of the kind of original work in these things done in the 60s and 70s, a lot of it was done in Scandinavia, and he used to talk about the big Swedish men, you know, Sigurdssons and those kinds of things that people were testing. You know, but you're like, you know, guys that are like 6'4" and weigh 215 and have 8% body fat in their cross country, but just these giant, you know, they're cross country athletes. So just imagine, you know, like an elite college wide receiver who is, you know, who's now, you know, just going to go skiing. That's what the Scandinavian guys are doing a lot of this. Okay, so that's what we've got. So what I'm showing you here, these are some data from the mid 70s. These are actually out of that book that I read that got me into being an exercise physiologist. These are U.S. Olympic distance runners, and you can see that their mean VO2 max was 77.4. They had some middle distance runners from college. Okay, these were good college middle distance runners. Their VO2 max was 70, and they had some untrained men who were about 38. Right. So Olympians are at 77. The middle distance runners, the good college athletes are at 70. That's not that different. I mean, it's about a 10% difference there. That's not that far off. We did a study in my lab a few years ago on not our good cross-country athletes, like our folks that didn't get to go to the conference meet. And the men, their average was about 76 mLs per kg per minute. We had a few women and they were at about 68, okay? So these weren't even like the top 7 or 8 in each gender of OU's distance runners, and they had values that are not that far off of that. So again, you need a high VO2 max to get you into the ball game. But once we're there, there's a lot of other things that separate the Olympians from the people who are just really good. Okay? So that's going to give you some idea of kind of what these values are going to look like. Okay. Megan's question. Peak versus max. Okay? Brief discussion about science in general. It is my contention that we are all scientists, okay? And as scientists, we like to change things ever so slightly, right? It is in my interest to tell Keldon that Keldon's way of doing things is good, but I can improve on it just the tiniest little bit, and then my way is better, right? And so in this way, we argue about what I think is dumb things a lot. And dumb things like, what is the name of something, okay? So in exercise physiology, one of these debates, we'll call it a debate, okay? In the spirit of the debate tonight, in that way. But this idea of what's called the VO2 peak versus the VO2 max, okay? So VO2 max is the highest rate of oxygen consumption elicited in theory during any activity, but it's the highest of all values. And so in general, to get the highest of all values, we need to run or cross-country ski, or maybe row. If you're a rower and we put you on a rowing ergometer, we can probably get a VO2 max value. We need to do something that uses both upper and lower body muscles to some extent. Additionally, it probably needs to have a plateau or a validation protocol where we're going to forcibly increase the work rate and we're going to get no further increase in VO2. Okay? In the purest sense, some people will say you cannot have a VO2 max in the absence of it is running on a treadmill and there was some kind of a plateau either during the initial protocol or during the validation protocol. Okay? That's the max. It's the highest of the high values. They then said that a VO2 peak refers to the highest measured O2 during any other activity that is not running. So we do your VO2 max test on the bike, okay? It's not, because it's on the bike and it doesn't involve your arms, although if anybody wants to get on YouTube and see some fun things, there's lots of like spin class things where people are like getting it on the bike while also doing like push-ups and stuff. It's pretty great. You're not using your arms nearly as much. And so a bike test cannot be a max test. It's a peak test. It's the highest attainable value on that exercise modality. Other people will say it also can mean a peak test is any test, regardless of modality, that does not show a plateau in VO2. Okay, if you don't show a plateau, it cannot be max because we can't know for sure that we increased work rate that you did not meet the goal. We can't know for sure that that's all that you got. Okay. Typically, values on the bike in non-elite cyclists are going to be maybe 5% less than what we're going to get if you put those same people on the treadmill. Okay. Elite cyclists, like Tour de France level cyclists, can probably get values just as high on the bike as they can running, because most of them don't run very much. And so there's some other issues that kind of go into that. Okay. That's this idea of a peak versus a max. Okay. Now, Megan, to your question, were you just wanting my opinion on this? Did you want to throw something in there for discussion? I'm just curious. Okay. In general, when you go to publish something, it's always safer to just call it a VO2 peak and move on with your life and never call it a max. If you've done a validation protocol, you just kind of throw your hands up and you're like, you know what, we're hedging our bets. I don't want somebody. It's always reviewer 2. I don't want reviewer 2 to get pissed off at me over something stupid like I called it a max when it was a peak, or maybe it was a max by this definition, but not a max by their definition, and they're lost in the semantics and they forgot about the actual experiment that we did. All they care about is my naming convention on my measure. Again, we need to focus on the important things like, hey, we trained these people, look at how it went up, or it went down, or it didn't change, or whatever, and you're lost in, did I call it this or that or something stupid? Happens way more than you probably would like to. But I also want to emphasize, because of that, that naming and semantics are important. Precision with your language is important, okay? Some people, hopefully not me very often, but some people will judge you that if you don't know the difference between a peak and a max, and you incorrectly call something a max when it really is a peak, they will think that you clearly have no idea what the fuck you're talking about. And then by proxy, they will think that I didn't teach you the difference, so I don't know what I'm talking about. And I don't like that, right? So we try to present kind of both things and just make you aware that this is out there, and make you aware that some people care a whole lot, okay? Is it a 1 rep max, or is it a 2 rep max, or is it a maximal voluntary contraction, or is it a maximal voluntary isometric contraction? And I throw my hands up and I'm like, really, it's 5. And is it a force, or is it a torque? And if it's a torque, that you put it in the right units, and you're just like, oh my God, dude, like you just, okay, that's peak versus max. We're kind of at the end here. Other things that matter are if it's arm versus leg. We did a study in one of my first jobs where we had people ride the bike on with their legs traditionally, and then we had them ride the bike sitting behind it like all of this and crank it with their arms. Okay. This is the craziest test you've ever done, because you get done and you cannot crank your arms anymore, and you're not even breathing hard, right? And we get VO2 values that are maybe 75% of what you get with your legs doing it like this, okay? So that would be arm crank peak test, bike peak test, but maybe if you validate it, you could call it a max. This is definitely a peak, even if you saw a plateau, this is a peak. And you can see the differences in max heart rate at the end of all of this. And so what you can see is by doing this is that clearly, because we're not engaging as much muscle mass, you've got more cardiac output that you could further increase. You can clearly make more energy in your body. But for other reasons, that's all that your arms can do, basically. Okay.
We talked about that one. Onset, offset kinetics, and pop.
Okay, we're going to stop here, guys. We'll pick up and we'll do the onset and offset kinetics on Thursday, and then we'll do our critical thinking questions, and we'll call it good there for our test.
So do you not want critical thinking then?
I do not need your critical thinking today. If you want to give it to me, I will take them, but y'all will have to remind me that I have them and to bring them with me to class on Thursday, because I am absent-minded, and it is, and I'm behind on my PT school reference letters, and people giving me like 3 days notice, like, hey, can you write me something, and it's due on Friday? And I'm like, yes, I can do it, I guess. It's fine. So there we go, okay? Good.